continuing on, this next section is pesticides and the health of all. And there's a quote from a scientist here at the beginning of the section that says, without a doubt, pesticide illness constitutes one of the most widespread environmental problems today. So I wanted to tell you about Silent Spring. Was the name of a book that Rachel Carson wrote years and years and years ago. It was in the 50s. It was just, attacked and all kinds of things, lost her job, a variety of other things. And there are videos about Rachel Carson, the book I would recommend reading. And I'll see if I can find a very short clip to put up for you today. You have so much to look at, but I'll try and do that. So but Silent Spring is, what a title, right? You spray this area with water to get rid of mosquitoes and a variety of other things, and it silently then winds up killing you. So one of the things about pesticides is that there are many of them, if not most of them, are what are called endocrine disruptors. So it completely disrupts and interferes with the hormonal activity of a human body. And glyphosate is one of the major chemicals that makes this happen. So if you're familiar with the Roundup by Monsanto, which people just spray all over their yards, and you see ads on television all the time about class action lawsuits if you've been, have cancers resulting from Roundup, contact us basically for a class action lawsuit. So that's a real, Roundup is a real prominent example of glyphosate-based pesticides. So there are many lawsuits right now happening around. About 40,000 people are involved in some kind of class action lawsuit. And pesticides are especially dangerous for farmers and agricultural workers, as you might imagine. I have a note here to tell you my apple story. And the apple story is that years and years and years and years ago, as a young woman, my husband and I traveled across the country in a school bus. And we had a 1.5-year-old, 2-year-old daughter at that point. And we stopped in Washington State, and we needed some cash, so we signed up to pick apples. And we picked apples for hours that day, and it was kind of fun. And the little one was sitting down on the ground while we were picking, and she'd take I'd give her an apple to eat or munch on or something, cut up a little bit for her. Well, then we went to the farmer's house. I'll never forget it, the back porch, to get paid. And there was a list of chemicals to be sprayed and when on the wall. And I looked at them, and I really didn't know that much intellectually, that knowledge piece we talked about earlier. But I just looked at the list of chemicals and went, oh my God, we can't do this anymore. And I felt terrible that I'd let my daughter even get near an apple at that point of the fat farmers. That's an example. I think that was my first real awakening to that kind of problem and issue. Years later, we lived in Watsonville, in one of the biggest areas of raising strawberries in the country. And the planes that used to come over and drop herbicides and pesticides on the strawberries were just amazing. This yellow dust would just pour out of the plane. They flew very, very low over them. So I've had a few personal experiences with either seeing or being around those kind of things happening. So glyphosate. Okay. And then as I said, and that's the apple story. Okay, we're going to move on. But pesticides are also in homes. 2011 study of homes in New York City the pesticides were detected in 64% of samples of umbilical cord plasma from newborns. Oh, that is so sad, isn't it? Okay, and in 100% of indoor air samples. This is in New York City. Okay. Not someplace adjacent to a big agribiz farm or something. And pesticides are omnipresent in our food. They have profound impacts on every stage of human reproduction. The example I give you here are the sperm count declining, and they're declining all over the world, sperm counts. You can Google that and look it up, and you'll see it's actually kind of shocking to a really large extent. And then of course, they're especially, herbicides and pesticides are especially dangerous for fetuses and birth defects. And then good news, a little bit of it here. We will get to good news, I promise you that. Figure 2.7 in your book shows you the labels of certified that label something and guarantee it to be certified organic in different countries. In the United States, we have that labeling here. And if it says certified organic, it is. It has to go through a huge process to be certified that way. So consumers have choices, right? I mean, when I'm shopping for fruits and vegetables, I only buy organic and have for years. Do they cost more? Yes, of course they do. And that is what this next issue is why do they cost so much? Well, it's policy. It's agribiz lobbying, right? Okay, and paying off politicians and contributing to campaigns and a variety of other things. They're advertising the whole ball of wax. You could regulate it, but we don't. We don't in the way that it should be regulated, the use of pesticides and herbicides. Um, so, but the other thing, I just want to put my 2 cents worth in here. You can afford to use organic fruits and vegetables if you cut down on other stuff, right? Like prepared foods, meat, it doesn't mean you stop eating it completely. You just have more in your budget for something else. It's choices, We have personal choices, but I understand completely, and that's what we're talking about here in terms of environmental justice. The personal choices are mitigated and often based upon economic and material issues. So I get it. I'm just saying that there are things one can do, and every little bit, certainly helps. Certainly wash everything as thoroughly as you can. Okay, in terms of fruits and vegetables. And this also has to do, these choices, I see people all the time shopping that are not buying in the organic section in the store, that some of them I know that could afford to. So here we get to knowledge again. You have to know this stuff for it to matter, to make a difference, to change behavior. Okay. So one justice. What is one justice? Getting to one justice and one health raises, of course, major roadblocks. And we just talked about some of the policy roadblocks and the systemic roadblocks. But another one is our focus on individualism, okay, in the United States. That makes what is bad for some people seem not so bad for other people, right? Well, it only killed so many people on some, town that's very poor or some Native American reservation. The rest of us are okay. That's what the problem here is, and that's not one justice for all. That's justice for a certain amount of people. It may even be a majority of people, as we'll see, but it's not really pure or true justice. And how we got here, and it's also because of individualism, we have this idea that they deserve it, right? I think I mentioned that last week. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you're not making it, it's your fault, rather than looking at the larger systems that impact people and affect people. So what is utilitarianism? Well, utilitarianism, I told you we were going to get into philosophy a lot this week, was First written about and thought about by Jeremy Bentham in 1776. That's how far back it goes. And what he said was, in 1776 language, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, that is the measure of right and wrong. Let me say it again. The greatest happiness for the greatest number, that is the measure of right and wrong. Or, in more modern terminology, and you may have heard this, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. It's called utilitarianism because the word good, is defined as utility, something that works, or the degree that an action promotes happiness. Well, here's number one problem. Happiness is a relative concept, right? Central to the utilitarianism is the idea that everyone's happiness has equal moral standing, no matter the person's social position. Well, now that sounds good. Okay, that sounds just. But most utilitarianism is very focused on results rather than on the way things are, a position that's known as consequentialism. So it's based on results or consequences. And it's actually found in a lot of modern thought, the idea of utilitarianism. The will of the majority, for example, is an idea of utilitarianism. I want to explain to you in a very simple way how unjust the will of the majority can be. Okay, say I have a class of 100 people, and we're in class. Okay, we're in person class, and I say I'm going to give you a choice. You can have a take-home midterm, or you can have an in-class midterm. Okay, and one's going to be easier and one's going to be harder because one's at home and you have more time to do it, and one's in class and it's going to be more multiple choice and true and false. So I'm going to let the majority rule here. Raise your hands who wants the in class, and who wants the take home. So 51% out of 100, 51 people out of 100 want the in-class test. 49 people want the take-home test. Is that fair? Because one person made the decision for everybody, ultimately, is what happened. Okay. This gets into our politics, too, because European countries don't have a majority rule situation. What they have is what's called proportional representation. And, this isn't that class, but it's something to think about and look up. Okay, so there's part of the problem with the will of the majority. So the other problem is that utilitarianism, remember, it's about consequences. One of the ways that they determine consequences is through economic growth and the GDP, the gross domestic product numbers that come out every year. And they look at that as a mark of social improvement. But the problem is that the GDP doesn't really give you social improvement. It gives you an economic average. Even when the GDP is rising, there are still a large number of very poor people who are, not in the job market or making nothing and, hardly anything, whatever minimum wage. So that is called economic utilitarianism, but it's the way a lot of decisions are made, right? So similarly, in thinking about utility and utilitarianism and consequences, okay, the use of pesticides and other toxins helps feed the world. Well, that's a consequence. So it must be for the greater good. Well, we know it's not, and we're going to parse this a little bit more here. So it's a common, very simplistic notion of justice, and has some major problems. It accepts, first of all, the inequality of the distribution of goods. Remember, we just talked about that? The GDP can be very high, but there are still tons of poor people. Okay? What if the greatest good comes at the expense of a smaller number of people? Okay, which in the model of utilitarianism, it invariably does. If you cut through the jargon, the implications are pretty stark. The greatest good comes first. So an example is if the GDP goes up, the gross domestic product, okay, the amount of money the country produces in goods and services, then utility has gone up too. Even if all the increase went to a few, think Jeff Bezos here. Okay. In the 1990s, the Supreme Court ruled that economic utilitarianism was synonymous with the public good. It was the same thing as the public good. And it was in a lawsuit, and they voted in favor, the Supreme Court, of they sanctioned the displacement of poor property owners with wealthier ones. So you kick out the poor ones, you let the rich ones move in, right? Because the wealthy would provide more tax revenue. That's utility, right? So utilitarianism can easily lead to the perverse result of benefiting only a minority while saying that it's doing the opposite. Even if there is a benefit for the majority, shouldn't we be concerned about the minority as well, who are disadvantaged? Doesn't democracy also exist to defend minority rights and to uphold everybody's liberty? Well, that's what we've been taught. That's what one would think. Now, a different way of thinking about this is philosopher John Rawls' concept of justice and fairness. He said this: we should be concerned about the minority, and for a very selfish reason. Basically, we might be one someday ourselves. We ourselves might wind up among the disadvantaged. We might lose our job. We might get a terrible illness and not be able to, have to declare bankruptcy because of paying for medical bills, which is the most common reason people have bankruptcy lawsuits in America. What would our principles of justice be if we had no idea where we would wind up in life? That's a good question. So he says you need to drop an imaginary veil of ignorance, and that's his term, Rawls's term, about your life's chances. And then from that position, this original position of not knowing, what would you want? What kind of principles of justice would people create or invent? And Rawls says there's two basic principles that would come out of that idea of thinking about if I didn't know where I was going to wind up, what kind of justice would I want in the world? And the two basic principles are that each person has an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty, compatible with a similar liberty for others. So that's crucial. Okay. You get the most liberty you can have, but it can't be more or less than somebody else's. Everybody else has to have the same amount of liberty. Okay? And the second point is that social and economic inequalities should be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all. Well, theoretically, we have that in America with the ability to run for office and have people vote for you. But the reality is that much of that is based on campaign contributions, as we know, or having money and power of your own to bring to the table. So a similar concept I wanted to put in here because I just love this of Marx's statement, which is a fair system can be summed up by this: from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. That would just, what a society that would just take care of it. Okay. From each according to his ability. It comes from those with more ability to those who have greater needs. Okay. In other words, go back to Rawls again. If we don't know where we wouldn't personally wind up in life, we would want the greatest good for everyone. Not, as utilitarians say, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but the greatest good for everyone, because we don't know if we would be one of those disadvantaged people or not. We would also recognize that our own good must be realized within the context of others' similar good. that the others are also pursuing in a just way their own good. And another concept in here is that liberty has constraints. Okay? Most especially, the constraint is to not impinge on the liberty of other people. Now, this is Rawls talking here again. And so we would recognize that we would not want others to seek advantage over us, right, in that context, and they would not want to, and they would not want to do the same to us. We wouldn't want to seek advantage over others. They would not want to seek advantage over us. We would also recognize that justice does not depend on everybody being exactly equal. This is a really important part. There are situations in which some forms of equality are functional and advantageous to everyone. And one of the examples they give you here is parents and children. Children gain an advantage of parents having more power in terms of protection. Students hopefully gain some advantage from the greater experience of teachers and their topics, even though teachers have more power than students. Citizens gain some advantage through the greater power of social organizations such as the police, fire department, medical experts, etc., etc. Okay, so all of the above, all of John Rawls' idea of justice can be summed up in the following sentence. All social values, liberty and opportunity, income and wealth, and the bases of self-respect are to be distributed equally, unless an unequal distribution of any or all of them benefits is to everyone's advantage, which I can't see how that, I can't think of an example at the moment. So Rawls' definition of injustice, the converse of that is injustice then is simply inequalities that are not to the benefit of all. And that approach, his approach is called, Rawls's, which is called justice for fairness, is a form of egalitarianism, or everything being equal. But I don't think we've fixed it all so fast. There are some real issues with that. And the Indian economist Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel Prize winner economist, he likes that fairness and justice that Rawls talks about. But what he sees, though, is that it needs to be more pluralistic. It needs to have a more pluralistic understanding of fairness and justice. What he asks is if not everyone has the same social values to be distributed equally. Okay? And everyone doesn't have the same social values, right, to be distributed equally, for sure. So what he sees, Amartya Sen, is he envisions a political system in which those with the minority views and cultures can still maintain their ideas and practices with others. Okay. And he suggests that we think of people as having functionings. So in that way, what he means by functionings, we'll get to that definition in a minute. Justice for Sen, then, is maximizing people's capabilities, what they're capable of doing or being, to maximize their functionings. So beings and doings, and that with your capabilities enables you to attain the functionings, to make it happen. You're capable. How do you make it happen? Is the system set up so that you can actually manifest your capabilities? So lack of justice, then, from his viewpoint, is when we do not do what we can do to give people these capabilities. So poverty is an example. Sen doesn't see poverty as a lack of money, but that poverty is what he calls, another wonderful term, capability deprivation. You may have heard this term, a similar idea, and it's called loss of human capital. That means that there are people out there in urban inner city ghettos and barrios and poor people up in the Appalachian Mountains and people on Native American reservations that might be able to find the answer to curing cancer, but we'll never know, right? Because their human capital is lost to us, or they might be great astrophysicists, whatever. That's loss of human capital and or capability deprivation. So because capabilities depend on more than money, ill health would be a form of capability deprivation. Some of these people you're seeing talking in your videos will not be able to manifest their full capabilities because it's all they can do to survive physically with the problems that they have. So would environmental situations that did not support well-being and the ability to secure a livelihood. Once again, situations that you'll see in the videos. So from Sen's work comes the idea of what's HDI, the Human Development Index, rather than just looking at the GNP, the gross national product, gross national product, or GNI, the gross national income. They've developed an index where you look at the human development in a particular population, and you combine it. Then you combine the human development index with the gross national income or gross national product. And they come with these two other measures: health. So part of the HDI is looking at the longevity rate in a country or a population. And this one is just also so crucial. Knowledge and access. Knowledge and access translates really into literacy and school enrollment rates. So when you look at countries, or once again, populations, these are two characteristics that tell you as much or more than what the gross national product is. So let's look now at the original position of mutual aid, and we can do better than what Rawls suggested in his fairness and justice ideas. Because at the heart of Rawls' theory is the conceptualization of people as rational actors. Are we all rational actors? I don't think so. Have you ever done anything completely irrational? I know I have. Maybe not in my own best interests. I'm sure we've all done that. Okay. So at the heart of his theory is the conceptualization of rational actors who are fundamentally economically self-interested. That's quite an assumption, right? Because by overemphasizing people's self-interest, I'm going to do what's best for me and forget about everybody else. Forget if it poisons the planet. Forget if it, puts my kids in danger, whatever. It underemphasizes the many other reasons people make ties with others. And here we're getting to this key idea of ties. The only way we can fix this mess we're in, environmentally and socially, is through creating ties with others. People, other sentient beings, other things. So Rawls' assumption is that we are selfish, which is a typically Western assumption. We are more selfish and more individualistic, Western peoples, than other cultures. But we aren't as selfish as many of these philosophers say we are. So Rawls' assumption is that we are selfish. And without that assumption, his theory wouldn't work. If you're not selfish, his theory doesn't work. Because this is what Amartya Sen is getting at through his focus on capabilities. Someone might actually be willing to let others have more of a particular piece of the pie, or may not want any of it in the first place. I want to, at some point, show you a film, I think probably in chapter 4 with about money and stuff, a film called A Poor Man Shames Us All. But at the moment, I want you to just think about that statement. It's a saying from the Gabra tribe in Africa: a poor man shames us all. So in our culture, who's supposed to be ashamed if they're poor? The poor person, right? And instead of seeing it as a community and mutual aid, that if someone's poor, something failed, right? In the group. It's a very different thought process. And yes, I think we can, I hope you all have an example or can think of a time when you were willing to let others have more of a particular pie. Okay. Even if that's giving a panhandler a buck, whatever it is, whatever you can help with. And it could have, as they pointed out, it might be something that you don't want yourself anymore, or you're not interested in. So sure, let them have it. Let them go for it. So a one justice, Rawls, I'm going to finish this up. Rawls' position about everybody being selfish and, rational and that type of thing matches the way we think about ourselves and the philosophy of individualism that is so strong. So, we think about if people get sick, we think about them getting sick individually. We don't think about the larger ecology that got them sick, okay? If somebody makes a lot of money, they did that individually. We don't think about the family background and how they got that money or inherited it or were able to go to the, elite universities that got them, into a situation where they could make a lot of money, that type of thing. Okay. So, but that's how we think. That's how we're conditioned to think in our culture. So a one justice framework requires a different starting place. And I want to go back to who gets sick individually and who makes money individually from it, because I want to tell you something. Did you know that George Bush got into Yale with a C- average? Could you get into Yale with a C- average from high school? I don't think so. So that's the point here, is the things that happen to people. What about people who get sick individually? People don't get sick individually. They get sick because of, for the most part, circumstances around them. Take pesticides and herbicides and cancer. Okay. So a one justice framework requires a different starting place. And it's that original position of mutual aid that we just talked about a minute ago, where we assume that these ties, these social ties, these ecological ties inform how we regard the world and our place in it. Okay. We start to learn to think that way, that we're all tied together. And it goes beyond the fair treatment of individuals. Okay, we're always hearing about fairness. Okay, it goes beyond that to recognize that we only truly do well when we all do well. Okay. And that's what I want. Here is what I want to explain to you about the Scandinavian countries. Do you know the tax rate is much higher in Scandinavia than it is in all the Scandinavian countries than it is in the U.S. Although it's distributed, the rich get taxed a lot more in Scandinavian countries than we do, but the average rate is much higher. And when they're asked why they're willing to pay it, particularly the wealthy in Scandinavia, they say, because we don't want to be like you. Americans, right? Look at your culture. Highest rates of homicide and gun violence, highest rates of industrialized nations, and actually the world now, highest rates of incarceration, right? Poverty, all of those things. It doesn't benefit us as rich people in Norway, say, to have a society like that. It makes for a lousy, violent, dangerous society. We don't want to live in it. So we're willing to cough up more. We're still rich, but we're willing to cough up a lot more so that we don't live in that kind of society. That's where mutual aid, that's an idea of mutual aid. Okay. And then the other point here is that the ties, these social and ecological ties in a one justice framework, are considered from the start. They're principled on the foundation, and this is so important, of empathy and impact. There is so much research done on empathy, and particularly children and empathy, and bullies in lack of empathy, and a variety of other things. Empathy starts learning empathy, being empathic and empathetic starts in infancy pretty much, and bonding and a variety of other things. You can do your own research on that. It's very, very interesting. But I think that's one of the reasons that we have these issues in America, aside from our uh, worldview about individualism. It is, and that people are basically selfish, et cetera. There's a huge lack of empathy uh, in this culture as well. And we've seen some examples of that, unfortunately, in the last few years with some incidents. Okay. So let's see. Now we're going to talk about this next part, which is so great, living downstream. The precautionary principle. Okay. The precautionary principle is the idea, the concept of living downstream. How do we actually incorporate these mutual ties we've been talking about? Okay. Empathy and impact and fairness, etc. In a world, how do we incorporate that in a world of states, and that means political systems, that are more focused on regulating than facilitating those good ties? Okay. Well, you can listen to what Greta Thunberg had to say, and that tells you something, because we do have a huge institutional failure to protect the future and your future. And the way it can be remedied is really, it's kind of a no-brainer. It's not that complex, but it goes across, it cuts into a lot of major financial and power interests in any country, but particularly in the US. And that is the precautionary principle, which goes back to my question, what did you think would happen? Okay. The precautionary principle provides a paradigm shift in the way we think about everyday interactions with the environment and how our government operates in protecting us today and the environment and preventing future tragic consequences. So precaution simply means thinking, behaving, and regulating in ways that prevent problems in the future. That seventh generation concept again that I talked about last week. You think generations way down the road. You can't always know, but you can certainly begin to think about it, and science can help us figure it out, okay? And think about these three concepts again. Precaution simply means thinking. Well, that's number one, okay? Thinking. Then you have to act on what you know. And then organizations have to regulate those things. Now, the way it works, every agency is required to operate on a cost-benefit analysis, which calculates on, in monetary terms for all the members of society. Okay. Let me give you an example. I'm going to run out of time here. A cost-benefit analysis. Many years ago, the Pinto automobile made by Ford had a defective gas tank situation. And if you ran into the back end of a Pinto at even a very low mileage, the damn thing exploded. So people were killed, people were disfigured horribly by fires and explosions. And it turns out when the lawsuits came up that Pinto had known all along that that was a problem. There's other examples with Firestone tires exploding, same thing when the lawsuits came along. But they did a cost-benefit analysis. And it cost less to pay people off in lawsuits for death and disfigurement than it did to retool everything in there and redesign the factories, the car, everything. That's a cost-benefit analysis. So another way to think about it is how ecologist Sandra Steinberg's metaphor of living downstream. Because we always are, right? whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we think about it or not, whether we know it intellectually or not, all of us always are living downstream. So it's best to realize it. Wake up, right? It's best to wake up and to realize it. We can wish we're separate, we can think we're separate, we can hope we're separate, but we're not separate. So, and none of the other life forms around us separate. Uh, and the trouble is, we often, and I would say most of the time, we don't look downstream in space and time. It's really this idea of looking downstream, or living downstream, I should say, is a reformulation of the golden rule. Wendell Berry, you should look up Wendell Berry. He's just a wonderful environmental writer. He's an old man now, lives on a farm, etc. Said, do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you. Let me read that again. Do unto those downstream as you would have those upstream do unto you. Because you're downstream somewhere in the system as well, right? Say. So this last part, I want you to know that I was not going to put up the Mercury and the People of Grassy Meadows story as videos for you, but there's two very short ones because it's so powerful. And it's so important, and it's important to know. It's Ontario, Canada, and they were literally living downstream from 200,000 pounds, 20,000 pounds of mercury that had been dumped into the river that feeds into the river that they all use for their water and the fish that they eat and all that type of thing. And the key point here, and after you see these videos and you'll see the people from the reservations actually talking themselves, it's very eloquently stated in your text. The key point to living downstream and everything we've just been talking about is those forced to bear the burden of proof should not be those downstream, but rather those upstream who are responsible for preventing pollution and environmental harm in the first place. And that is rarely the case. The burden of proof is almost always on the people who have been horribly affected. So making these ties, making these connections, the one justice, one health approach is not just about regulation. It may sound like we've talked a lot about that, but that's not really, it's certainly not exclusively what it's about. It's a piece of it. But it's making ties across time and social space and species before bad things happening. And it is also enabling community power. Enabling ties to grow and flourish within a community. And power is not necessarily a bad thing, especially community power, but think about what it would be like if you had no power, if you felt like you had no power over your life. There's a lot of research on that. It isn't good. And it's exactly what Amarita Sen emphasizes, which is the importance of people's capabilities to achieve the functionings they value. Okay, so for humans, control has to be within the context of others seeking to achieve the functions they value for themselves. Okay, we all support that in one another. That is the beauty of teaching, to tell you the truth. That ability to, that control within the context of others seeking to achieve the functioning they value themselves. Justice then requires a means of balancing these capabilities so that we don't disadvantage others. Excuse me. So for community power to flourish, a rethinking has to occur. The understanding of our bodies and ourselves has to be larger. And then just this atomistic, individual casing of skin that we're in. We have to get to the larger perspective here. So how we consider health and justice, how we think about our bodies and their interactive relationships with the world are all very, very much a part of that. And I made myself a note here to say, this is me, not your text. Put down your devices at some point. Put them down. They're useful. They can be fun. I suppose they can be, well, I know they can be enlightening at times. But man, you can't do any of this if you don't look up and if you don't get out into the natural world. I mean, we live by the ocean. We live by the woods. There's so much to go and be, and see and do and be part of that is not this. I think that what's happened so much, I've noticed it over the years, because I've seen the transition of students before the technology and after the technology, and before cell phones and after cell phones and all of that. And our world has gotten or your world, I don't do it. Mostly, I don't want to do it. I choose not to do it. Let me put it that way. Uh, it's just narrowed down. I can't believe people watch movies on cell phones. Oh, the poor directors, having grown up in Hollywood and knowing something about the business and what is involved in making movies and how much thought into infinitesimal little details. And then, people are watching them on cell phones. Same with photography. It's just amazing how narrow our focus has become. So I think part of the benefit of putting it down, try 15 minutes a day or whatever, is to broaden that. No wonder we don't have a sense of ourselves as part of a whole, because we're not, our whole gestalt is in this little thing. We don't even use our whole hands anymore. You just use your thumbs, It's really something when you think about it. So that's one way to get there, or to get a little more experience of what it feels like to be connected to the larger ecology. And so when we do this, when we get out of this atomistic, personal, individual space, one of the things that happens is that we get the recovery of the body in environmental thought, and that's led to many new ways of being and living, from the slow food movement, which is such a powerful movement. It started in Europe, it started in Italy as a resistance to the fast foods that were coming into Italy. Food has such deep cultural meaning in many other cultures. And that is good, clean, and fair food for all. When you think about, now we have a Food Quality Protection Act, and that doesn't do a lot of good in a larger area, but it does help. It's directed particularly at attention to the developmental differences in children and what amounts of chemicals they can ingest safely. And look at the growth in farmers markets and crafts fairs, so the individual person you're buying the produce from, you can talk to them about different varieties. And boy, does it taste different. And so the growth of those things, farm to table restaurants that specialize in farm to table food, where you can actually see, you're ordering a steak, where is it sourced from? And they'll tell you which farm, and that type of thing. So there is hope, and I hope that it isn't all getting to be too much and too depressing this early in the term for you. And what I'm going to start doing, I think, is putting up some hopeful videos for you to look at, as well as the ones that cover the disasters that we're looking at in the various chapters. And then maybe that'll help you too. So see you next week.